Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass. This is a series in which I, as a younger gamer who hasn't experienced much of our gaming past, goes back to old but venerated titles I haven't played before to see what they were remembered for and how well they hold up today. In this video, I take a look at a hallmark within the FPS genre, the original Half-Life. When I was first thinking about playing this, I was under the impression that it was a well-liked shooter and that Half-Life 2 was considered the better game, so I was a little hesitant to look at it instead of the sequel. Then I actually started playing it, did a little more research, and then I made the realization that I think a lot of people made back at its release. This isn't just a good game, this is something more than that. This game was the first of a lot of things. It was the first game that Gabe Newell created with his new studio, Valve, after parting ways with Microsoft. It took a long time to get a publisher for the game, simply because a lot of them saw it as too ambitious, but eventually Sierra picked it up and the rest was history. It was the first game to ever use the scripted sequence instead of cutscenes to tell the story, giving you limited control as to how you viewed everything within it. It was one of the first games to connect virtually the entire area that you're in within a consistent place, to where you're not just moving from level to level, but progressing in a more coherent way. Sure, there were still loading pop-ups if you passed a certain point, but everything was seamless apart from that. Despite being a linear story, it still maintained a lot of the good elements of classic FPS, with the level design holding extra health and ammo packs off the beaten path, and using inaccessible areas to try and help convey the story and world as a whole. Despite the issue getting a publisher, it marked Valve as a good developer right off the bat, allowing them to create a sequel with their new Source engine, which would become the basis of all of their future games. Half-Life 2 would later use an update platform of its own to help downloads, and before long that would become the gaming behemoth we know today as Steam. This was the game that set the snowball rolling for Valve's success as a developer, and the game's success also transformed the landscape of FPS overall, kicking open the door for other games to follow, such as Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare and BioShock. With that said, coming from someone who has never played it, how well does it hold up under a modern lens? To help answer that, it's important to know my relationship with the Call of Duty series, as that's the series that has, to some extent, bastardized the scripted sequence. As such, bear in mind the only amount of time I have actually spent in a Call of Duty game is about 15 minutes in Modern Warfare 3's co-op. This means that I haven't become jaded to the scripted sequence, as I don't run into them a whole lot in the games I usually play, so bear that in mind. With that said, let's jump right into it. Right off the bat, the game lets you know that the story and world is going to be an important part of the game, by having you spend about 6 minutes in a tram. Fortunately, you can skip it and the other story scene immediately after it by starting your game after the events that set everything in motion. You are Gordon Freeman, a physicist from MIT who is working in Black Mesa, a research facility whose purpose is intentionally kept vague. You are sent to work with a volatile sample of something or other, insert experiment going horribly wrong, and then you have to make your way past the dangers you come across in order to reverse or halt the damage by said volatile sample of something or other. As you move along though, not everything is as it seems. What exactly happened, something called a resonance cascade, has dragged some sort of aliens into the facility, meaning you'll have to deal with them as you move along. Also, soldiers are arriving in order to try and control the situation, but as you quickly learn, they're more interested in covering it up by destroying everything and everyone, including you, which means the only ones you can trust are the few security guards and scientists who are still breathing. The game's story was fairly unique at the time it was created, as instead of focusing on one badass hero out to murder everything in his way, it focused on a scientist trying to deal with the crisis. On its own, that might not have been enough for us, but the way it's presented is what sells you on it. Most importantly, it borrows one of the main rules that a lot of visual media should abide by: show, don't tell. There is a decent amount of talking from the admittedly interchangeable officers and scientists, but it never feels overdone. Beyond that, the way the world represents itself, offering small clues to keep you interested in what's happening overall, gives you just enough to work with, but not enough to satiate that desire to know what's going on. For instance, shortly after things go awry, there are a couple of inaccessible rooms where you see a pair of scientists. The one you're likely to see first, given the direction you're coming from, is a scientist struggling against a headcrab, killing it, but then getting killed by another one. The second is a scientist with a headcrab already on him, and we get to see how these mutant zombie things are created. Also, from the beginning scene in the tram to further exploration into Black Mesa's facilities, we see a man that stands out from the rest of the crowd, with a blue suit rather than the white smock the scientists wear, or the blue uniforms of the security guards. We aren't told who he is, we aren't even told what to think about him, but at least initially, he never says anything to us, and even at the end, it's never fully explained who he is. To say more than that would be to spoil the game, but now that you know to look for him, that should give you plenty to work with. Through these small hints, the game encourages you early on to explore, and to help those you come across, either to rescue the scientists or to help the officers. Doing so can give you a tangible reward in the game, either by giving you someone to safeguard against head crabs, heal you a little bit, or to help access areas you may not have been able to reach otherwise. The way that the story and gameplay affect and add to each other helps keep the immersion. There are very few times when you are prevented from moving forward by someone talking, and even when that is the case, the dialogue never feels wasted, and I never felt the desire to try and avoid talking with someone. For most of the dialogue though, you can walk away while they're talking and just ignore them, and there's also nothing stopping them from getting killed mid-sentence by something. The dialogue is overall well done, and made even more important since your protagonist is silent. The problem that you sometimes have going in with a silent protagonist is that everything else has to be well built up and interesting, because we usually won't know our character's reaction. If you can overcome that weakness though, it does and did work out in this game's favor. You might be referred to as Gordon Freeman, but for all intents and purposes, you're the actor here, and it's you that has to get to the surface and avoid the strange creatures being brought in, as well as the military who want to keep the whole situation covered up. In what dialogue the game has, it does a good job of balancing the needs of the player with what the characters would actually say to Gordon Freeman. The scientists speak to him as if he is a scientist, and the way they reveal information is also cleverly done to ensure the character immersion is maintained. This early scene before everything goes to hell demonstrates this fairly effectively.
It will be deviating a bit from standard analysis procedures today, Gordon.
Yes, but with good reason. This is a rare opportunity for us. This is the purest sample we've seen yet.
And, potentially, the most unstable.
Now, if you follow standard insertion procedures, everything will be fine.
I don't know how you can say that, although I will admit that the possibility of a resonance cascade scenario is extremely unlikely.
Gordon doesn't need to hear all this. He's a highly trained professional. We've assured the administrator that nothing will go wrong.
Yes, you're right. Gordon, we have complete confidence in you.
Well, go ahead. Let's let him in now.
The only problem with this is that, for some reason, the dialogue is a lot softer than the rest of the game's audio, and despite digging around in the options menu more than once, I couldn't find a way to balance it out. There was more than one time where I didn't catch what someone said due to my footsteps drowning it out, even while I was listening to it again while editing the main playthrough. This became even more of a problem later in, where I missed a cue from a scientist to do something, and then ended up dying for not acting on what he said. As for the visuals, they do look fairly outdated, even on the source engine. There is an option to enable HD textures, but even then, it helps the gun models, though some of the reload sounds disappear for some reason, but doesn't do very much on its own for the character models. However, I don't mind the low quality graphics for two main reasons. First, the graphics themselves don't determine a game's overall worth, at least not on their own. There is the argument for a more immersive experience, but art style and cohesion will sell that over graphics any day. Just look at Minecraft if you want examples of that. It's not a pretty game by any means, but what you can do within it is what makes the game compelling and interesting to a lot of people. Graphics certainly do help, but they aren't the be-all end-all. It definitely helps that the gameplay is good as well, but that brings me to my second point. Because there is overall less detail, that means the important aspects, such as the locations of buttons, platforms, crates, and overall where you need to go, more obvious. Either due to a lot of playing Dota-style games and action RPGs, or something else entirely, I have trouble keeping my eyes locked in one place for any length of time, which makes it hard for me to find important details, even when I know they should be there. It's the main thing that has kept me from being good at FPS for a while now, as it's easy for me to get overwhelmed by games with a lot more detail and depth to their world, and miss the important details until someone has put a bullet in my head. Even if you take out the fact that I was trying to speak while doing the recorded playthrough, it was still somewhat a problem with this game, but not nearly as much as it usually is. It's really hard to create a setting that simultaneously has enough detail to keep you immersed, while also making sure the important details stand out just enough, and Half-Life is one of those rare games. However, the loading screens do tend to be a bit jarring, especially given how lengthy they are. To suddenly be moving around as normal only to then hit a loading screen and be stuck waiting for something to happen, especially when you're in a firefight or your next action could be vitally important to your life, is a bit annoying. However, the loading screens are a small price to pay in order for a map that, for the most part, is completely interconnected. If you explore enough, you'll find yourself seeing where you've been, which helps give a more realistic perspective to this facility. With all of that said, it wouldn't be an FPS if you weren't shooting something, and as convincing as the story and setup are, if the gameplay didn't hold up, it wouldn't have become the hallmark we recognize it as. Fortunately, the gameplay is honestly the best part, following in the lines of old school FPS. The mantra while playing any old game is simple: save early, save often. There are autosaves whenever you hit a loading screen, but if there's one thing you learn about old school FPS, a lot can happen in a short span of time. Your ammo is limited, your health and, for lack of a better term, armor is limited, and the enemies are not going to play nice. Because of the setting, the enemy variety is fairly good, ranging from the iconic head grab to other aliens to soldiers, sentry guns, and some much larger, more threatening aliens you find later on. This is where one of the game's main strengths come into play. The enemy variety may not be as diverse as future games, but the level design more than makes up for it. Apart from maybe an area or two in the final stages of the game, which I don't dare show you to avoid spoilers, every area feels unique, like a new challenge that has to be overcome. Because of your limited ammo and health, you can't just run into each room spraying and praying. You have to approach it from a tactical manner, more reminiscent of a puzzle or strategy game. Your approach will be different. What weaponry you use will be different. The enemies and layout themselves will be different. In one section, you're having to shoot enemies from within a ventilation shaft. In another, you're out in the open and having to deal with a helicopter and bunker across of a dam. The game is very linear, but because of the good level design, I never found myself caring. It didn't explicitly tell me where to go for the most part, meaning I had to think through where I needed to and could go, rather than just being told to go in one direction or another. The path doesn't branch very often, but in the few times where it does, there was some extra health or ammo, a glimpse of where you've been as a sign of how far you've come, or another story or world tidbit to keep you guessing. Without even having a visible map, this game managed to portray a lot, and despite being someone who is terrible at orienteering, I found that, for the most part, the game and I agreed as to where to go. There were a couple of times where I had to backtrack because I got stuck though. In one of them, I had moved past a live wire and was unable to get back to check to see if I had missed something. I eventually found that there was a switch to turn off the wire, and I had mixed feelings after seeing this. On one hand, I shouldn't have gone past a live wire that I had seen killing headcrabs to begin with. On the other hand, if it was such a big deal, the game probably shouldn't have let me get past in the first place. An argument could be made either way, and I'm sure you'll all tell me how much of an idiot I was in the comments for not finding that stupid switch sooner. Trust me, I've already beaten myself up enough for it. I don't need your nonsense. As for the game's difficulty, they did a good job to make it hard but fair. It starts out fairly easy, to the point where I thought it might have been a mistake to play on normal, until I got further in. Slowly but surely it ramps up the difficulty, using the changes in arrangement to throw different challenges at you and keep you on your toes, eventually becoming fairly hard unless you're a good shot or utilize the area you're thrown into really well. This is not a game that's afraid to punish you for acting like an idiot, and there were multiple times where I died and had to try again, or ended up losing much more health and ammo than I could afford to, and ended up needing to reload a game save. In a few other cases, I tried to soldier on when I had lost a lot of health or ammo, slowly clawing my way back up to a standing position, which was both annoying and kind of awesome. The kind of scenario that this creates makes the game feel much different, as you have to approach each room much more cautiously than otherwise. Sure, I shouldn't have taken the hits in the first place, but I found there was something enjoyable about conquering that challenge in the first place, despite the difficulty I created for myself. This is why a lot of older games prefer health packs over regenerating ammo. It creates dynamic gameplay in and of itself for when you screw up by forcing you to play very differently. Without changing anything, you create a very different play experience that makes your playthrough unique, even though nothing actually changes about the room the second time you play it. Along with this, the different difficulty levels can be changed on the fly as you play, allowing you some control over how hard or easy you want the game to be. For the entire live playthrough, I stayed on normal difficulty, and after checking out hard mode in a second game session, it definitely earns its name. The enemy types and number of enemies don't change much, if at all, but they hit harder, you don't hit as hard, and health pickups and recharge stations don't give you as much health, forcing you to be even better at handling situations as they come than before. As someone who hasn't finished a single-player FPS in a while, it was definitely a challenge in the time I spent with it, even at the very start. The list of gameplay issues I have are very short. First, the weapons either don't necessarily seem well balanced or are counterintuitive to control. The assault rifle and shotgun seem to be a lot less effective overall than the revolver and crossbow, which can both one-shot a good number of enemies if you aim well. Granted, you get a lot of assault rifle and shotgun ammo from taking on the military, which is probably why they are weaker, but even then, it feels like the basic pistol you receive at the very beginning might actually be a better call than the assault rifle, simply because it doesn't shoot through ammo insanely fast, doesn't have as long of a reload time, and you can use it from a further and safer distance. About the only time I used the assault rifle and shotgun was at close range against the military, and some of the smaller aliens, and to use the grenade on the rifle to clear a room quickly. Also, the way you use the rocket launcher is counterintuitive at best. Instead of throwing out a rocket to take down something and then ducking back into cover, like most weapons, instead, your rocket follows the direction of the laser sight over the reticle. This means instead of fire and hide, you fire and move out of cover to point it at your target, which is weird, but once I figured it out, it did make dealing with helicopters and tanks a lot easier. My second gameplay issue is with how finicky Gordon Freeman controls. For some reason, he must have taken up sprinting before joining Black Mesa, because every one of his steps is an Olympic-level lunge. This becomes even more annoying when you factor in basic platforming levels, which helps make the game feel more varied, but becomes a pain when you find yourself dying over and over again because of what felt like unrefined controls. Even while moving through the air, it can be kind of hard to control in there. After you jump forward, moving backwards while in the air doesn't slow down your trajectory a little bit, as you might be used to if you've played a decent number of FPS, but instead sends you to a complete stop mid-air. This becomes even more noticeable when you get something that allows you to vault forward later in the game, because obviously in a game about a physicist, Gordon Freeman is above the laws of physics. Oh, you were worried about overshooting your target? Guess who's taking more fall damage when you don't reach it? But now we come to the third and most egregious gameplay issue. Words cannot describe how infuriating and disappointing the final boss fight was. Without spoiling anything, instead of relying more on what Half-Life is good at, creating interesting environments and good level design for you to experience a new challenge as you move along, that challenge was replaced by a bland room that teleports you to other rooms, only to then find out those rooms are only used to restock your ammo and distract you even more with smaller monsters, again. Worse, you keep getting forced back to one of them until you finally figure out how to beat the damn guy, struggling with how Gordon Freeman moves through the air all the way, and only having one enemy move that you need to worry about. Holy crap, I thought the Diablo 2 boss fights weren't well designed. This is a masterclass on how not to end an epic video game. I know it's a final boss fight. I know it's not the main attraction. I know that when everything is great that I really shouldn't mind it so much. But you built up to it so well, spoon-feeding a story about what was going on, and then had that as your payoff. Imagine if this game was the Eiffel Tower, a masterpiece in engineering and a well-respected landmark. The final boss fight is a cobbled mess of a Lego tower that falls over if you breathe on it wrong, and has the creative genius of a 5-year-old. Apart from those issues, this is still a good game. I definitely found myself frustrated with parts beyond what I've mentioned, but there were very few times where I felt that frustration was the result of poor game design. Most of it was just my own ineptitude at first-person shooters, and nothing more than that. If you haven't played this yet, and have any interest in single-player FPS, you should. Even by today's standards, while it does struggle in the controls department, when it gets right, it really gets right. You can find this game, as well as the rest of the Half-Life series, over on Steam. As a final word, here are my recommendations regarding your options with the game. You will no doubt find that you have more than just Half-Life Source available to you. There is also the game on the original engine, a modified Quake engine, and a couple of side campaigns. I've been playing through them because I want to know more about how the story pans out, so here are my thoughts on them. The original Half-Life could be nice to go back to, but only has a historical set piece to see how much of an improvement the Source engine was over their old engine. It's easier to get stuck on things, the controls seem even floatier, and the resolution is locked to a 4x3 display, which means if you're playing on anything above a 720p monitor, enjoy the black bars. Unfortunately, the ended campaigns are also running on the old engine, as these weren't directly developed by Valve, but rather by Gearbox. There's some trivia for you. Before they made Borderlands and Borderlands, they were part of the Half-Life series. Despite the problems I have with the old engine, Gearbox does a good job at emulating what was good about the base game and adds a fair amount to those mechanics. They do retread old ground, such as a fight with a giant alien that has to be killed by manipulation of the environment, but they make it different enough to where you don't find yourself caring. Blue Shift follows security guard Calhoun caught up in all of the madness. The campaign is overall shorter than the other two, and focuses more on interacting with the facility and the scientists. I found myself getting stuck a decent amount while playing this, as it had a higher emphasis on the environmental puzzles, but it was still enjoyable to slowly help some of the scientists on their separate quest to escape Black Mesa. Opposing Forces focuses on U.S. Marine Adrian Shepard, who arrives at Black Mesa after things have heated up, and follows his adventures as he tries to escape the chaos. This one is much more about gunplay and working with your fellow soldiers, which lends itself to some strange and awesome guns. I ended up spending an entire afternoon just playing this as I was having so much fun with it, especially after they gave me an LMG. It felt awesome to unload with it on a nearby enemy, but just because they gave it to you doesn't mean it isn't still hard. The enemies you run into are definitely going to require the focus fire that the LMG can give, and you still have to be careful. I honestly didn't go in expecting to like it because I would end up playing to some extent the bad guy, but I was completely wrong. Rule number 1 when playing Half-Life: things are not always as they seem. Without spoiling anything, we get the feeling of a clear-cut difference between the military and everyone else from Gordon Freeman's perspective, but within the military's ranks, is it really that simple? In both campaigns, as you continue to move through Black Mesa, you will move through areas that you traverse in the other campaigns, which is a cool way to remind you of how the stories are interconnected, as well as getting to see glimpses of the other characters here and there. In fact, I became aware of one plot element in the main game from something I heard one of the soldiers say in Opposing Forces, which was really cool. In short, if you're going to pick up Half-Life, pick these two up. You won't regret it. However, a quick word of warning before you play either of the extra campaigns. Complete the main one first. As I've already mentioned, plot elements do cross over and you do run into each other at different points, so for the sake of story cohesion, you're better off playing the original first. I completed Opposing Force before Blue Shift because I got stuck on an area in the latter, but which one you do first really doesn't matter. Even if the story doesn't matter to you, then you'll want to wait until jumping right in, because both add-ons do start and become harder than the base game, so you'll want to play through the first to ensure that you're ready for a fight. As for the game's length and replayability, according to my raw footage, it took me about 10.5 hours to complete the main story. I didn't record all of my time in Opposing Force or Blue Shift, but according to Steam I spent about 6 hours in Opposing Force and 3 hours in Blue Shift. Bear in mind that part of the length of the original was me figuring out again how to use the controls properly, so part of the reason the other campaigns are shorter is because of that. Unless you're replaying it to possibly find more tidbits to the story, to find more secrets scattered around Black Mesa, or to beat it on a higher difficulty, there's very little reason to go back through a second time. It's a game that's short and sweet, doesn't overstay its welcome, apart from that stupid boss fight, and I'm glad I got to play it at last. Is it worth the $10 price tag? That's gonna be more up to your personal preference, and given the game's age, I can definitely understand if it's a hard sell. If that's the case, just wait for a major Steam sale and you should be able to grab everything Half-Life related for $20, and then you can experience everything there is within the series if you haven't already. With that said, thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you enjoyed it, and keep an eye on this channel for the next series of Through the Looking Glass. Leave your thoughts on this video and what I should play next below, and may your adventure through Black Mesa be an enjoyable one.